I'm 76 years old now, and that number feels heavier than I expected, not because of the years themselves, but because of what they carry, because when I say it out loud, I don't hear age anymore, I hear distance. I hear time that didn't slow down when I assumed it would. I'm sitting at a large wooden table as I say this, one that was custom made years ago, big enough for holidays, big enough for conversations that stretch late into the night. And tonight it holds nothing but silence, the kind that doesn't feel peaceful, only final. There was a moment not long ago when I finally understood what I had done, not in theory, not as a vague sense of regret, but as something physical and undeniable, something I felt settle into me quietly, without drama, without warning, as if it didn't want to interrupt. It didn't arrive with panic or tears or raised voices. It arrived politely, almost gently, after dinner in a spotless house, the kind of clean that only exists when no one truly lives in a place anymore, when no one leaves fingerprints, shoes by the door, or noise behind. I remember standing there, looking around at everything I owned, everything I worked for, and realizing there was no one left to notice it with me, no one to comment on it, no one to share the moment with. And that realization landed harder than any loss I had experienced before. That was the moment, not the day my last child moved out, not the day my marriage ended, not the day I retired, but this ordinary, forgettable evening where nothing happened except the truth finally stopping its patience with me. I had built a fortune and I had lost my family, and for most of my life those two facts lived in separate rooms in my mind. Success in one place, relationships in another, never allowed to meet, never compared, never questioned together. I told myself one didn't have to damage the other. I believed that deeply, believed sacrifice was temporary, believed absence could always be explained, believed love was patient enough to wait while I finished what I started and became who I thought I needed to be. I thought time was something I could manage, something flexible that I could stretch and rearrange when it suited me, something that would slow down once I was ready, and I didn't realize that time doesn't negotiate, doesn't argue, doesn't warn you before it moves on. I look around this house now and I see proof of a life that worked exactly the way I planned it to, a career that succeeded, accounts that grew, goals that were met one by one. And yet the voices that were supposed to fill this space are gone. What hurts isn't that they left, it's understanding why. It's realizing that no one took anything from me, that no one forced my hand, that I gave it all away myself, slowly, confidently, piece by piece, while believing I was doing the right thing. I didn't feel like a bad person while I was doing it, and that's what still unsettles me most, because I felt responsible, focused, committed, convinced I was making necessary choices, the hard choices, the kind people respect and praise. I told myself I was doing what had to be done, that one day I would slow down and everything else would still be there waiting for me, unchanged and forgiving, ready for my return. And I never questioned that assumption because it sounded reasonable and adult. People called me disciplined, driven, reliable, and no one ever said, "Be careful, you're disappearing," and I didn't notice either. Because loss doesn't announce itself when it's happening gradually, it hides inside routines, schedules, and good intentions. That night at the table, something shifted, and I realized I had reached the end of a very long road without ever looking up, surrounded by everything I built, everything that worked, everything that proved my effort meant something. Everything was solid, impressive, even, and completely empty. And I sat there longer than I needed to, not because I was tired, but because standing up meant accepting what the silence represented and admitting this wasn't temporary. No one was running late, no one was busy, no one was about to walk through the door. And for the first time I understood that this wasn't a phase or a pause, it was the result of decades of choices that finally added up. I had spent my life preparing for a future that arrived without the people it was meant for, And in that moment I understood something that still stays with me now, something quiet and permanent. Regret doesn't come from failing, it comes from succeeding at the wrong thing for too long, and that realization doesn't scream, it settles in calmly, deeply, and once it's there, it never really leaves. When I was younger, I carried a belief that felt solid and unquestionable, a belief that shaped every decision I made, and that belief was simple. My value came from providing, from working harder than everyone else, from making sure the people I loved never had to worry about money, stability, or survival. I told myself that love was practical, that responsibility mattered more than presence, and that being dependable was more important than being available. Because availability didn't pay bills, didn't build futures, and didn't protect the people you cared about from uncertainty or fear. I believed my role was clear and non-negotiable, that sacrifice was part of adulthood, that comfort came later, and that if I just pushed a little longer, stayed focused a little more, everything else would eventually fall into place exactly the way it was supposed to. Long hours didn't feel like a problem back then, they felt like proof that I was committed, that I was serious, that I was doing what needed to be done. And every time I missed something important, I told myself it was temporary, necessary, and ultimately forgivable. When birthdays passed without me, I reassured myself that there would be more. When dinners happened without my chair filled, I convinced myself that presence could be postponed. And when distance appeared, I explained it away as stress, not damage. I believed that relationships were resilient by default, that love didn't need constant attention, and that the people closest to me would understand why I wasn't there. Because I was doing all of it for them, even when they never asked me to. There was comfort in that belief because it removed urgency, it allowed me to delay difficult conversations, and it let me prioritize work without feeling selfish, because in my mind, everything I was building had a noble purpose attached to it. I remember telling myself that one day, when things slowed down, I would show up fully, that I would be present without distraction, without deadlines hanging over me, and that the years I missed would somehow balance out once the pressure eased. That future version of myself felt real enough that I didn't question the present, and I didn't ask what was quietly happening while I stayed focused elsewhere, because belief can be a powerful shield against uncomfortable truths. People praised my dedication, my discipline, my consistency, and those compliments reinforced the story I was telling myself. Because no one applauds absence directly, they applaud effort, results, and sacrifice, especially when it looks productive. I mistook validation for confirmation, and I mistook confirmation for truth, never stopping to consider that the same qualities that made me successful professionally were slowly making me invisible pay. Thus only, I thought I was laying a foundation, but I didn't see that foundations only matter if people stay long enough to stand on them, and I never questioned whether I was giving them a reason to stay. Work gave me structure, clarity, and measurable progress, while relationships required patience, presence, and emotional attention, and without realizing it, I gravitated toward the thing that rewarded me immediately. Every late night felt justified, every postponed weekend felt reasonable, and every missed moment felt like a necessary trade-off, because I believed the outcome would eventually erase the cost. I never asked myself what it meant to be needed emotionally, because I was too focused on being needed practically, and I assumed the two were interchangeable, or that one could easily replace the other. I didn't think I was choosing work over family. I thought I was choosing family through work, and that distinction mattered deeply to me at the time, because it allowed me to keep going without doubt. Looking back now, I see how dangerous that belief was, not because it was cruel, but because it was convincing, because it sounded responsible, and because it allowed years to pass without forcing me to confront what I was actually losing. It never felt like I was making a single decision that would change everything, because nothing I chose seemed large enough to matter on its own, And that's what made it so easy to keep choosing the same way day after day without ever stopping to question where those choices were leading. Each decision was small, almost invisible, the kind you don't remember later because it doesn't feel important at the time, like staying an extra hour at work, postponing a conversation, answering briefly instead of fully, or telling yourself you'll make it up to them soon. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to be absent. I simply allowed work to fill every empty space because it always came with a reason, a deadline, or a sense of urgency that made everything else feel secondary and less immediate. When someone needed my attention at home, I listened while thinking about something else, and when they needed my presence, I offered reassurance instead, convincing myself that understanding could substitute for time, and that intention mattered more than consistency. There were moments when I sensed frustration, disappointment, or distance, but I treated those moments like temporary inconveniences rather than signals, telling myself that stress affected everyone and that things would return to normal once life settled down. I became skilled at explaining things away, at reframing concern as overreaction, and at labeling emotional needs as timing issues. Because that interpretation allowed me to continue doing what I was already doing without disruption. Every time I chose work, I told myself it was just this once, even though this once kept repeating until it became the pattern, and patterns are hard to see when you're the one living inside them. I missed ordinary moments more than big ones, and that's what I didn't understand until much later, because it's the ordinary moments that build familiarity, trust, and closeness, not the occasional appearances you make when your schedule allows it. At first, no one said much because people are patient when they believe something is temporary, and they give you the benefit of the doubt when they think you eventually show up in the way they need you to. Over time, the questions changed, becoming shorter, less frequent, until eventually they stopped altogether. And I didn't notice when that happened because silence doesn't demand attention the way conflict does. I thought the absence of arguments meant stability, when in reality it meant resignation, because people stop fighting for connection when they no longer believe it will change anything. The years passed through repetition, through similar days stacked on top of one another, each one feeling harmless, manageable, and productive, even as something essential was quietly eroding beneath the surface. I became a familiar background presence rather than an active part of their daily lives, someone who existed reliably but distantly, someone whose role was defined more by responsibility than by relationship. I told myself that loyalty meant staying consistent in my work, that discipline was proof of love, and that one day all of this effort would make sense to everyone involved, including me. There were times I noticed the emotional gap growing wider, but instead of stepping closer, I leaned further into what I knew how to do well, because competence felt safer than vulnerability. Work rewarded me immediately, while connection required patience and attention without guarantees, and without realizing it, I chose the environment where effort translated directly into results. I didn't understand that relationships don't fail loudly most of the time. They fade quietly when attention is consistently diverted elsewhere, and by the time the damage is obvious, the habits that caused it are deeply ingrained. I told myself I was being dependable, when in reality I was becoming predictable in the worst way, always choosing the same thing when it mattered, always postponing what couldn't be scheduled. Every small choice felt justified in isolation, but together they formed a direction I never consciously chose, one that carried me further away from the people I believed I was doing all of this for. Looking back now, I can see how the distance didn't appear suddenly. It accumulated slowly, shaped by repetition rather than intention, and reinforced by a belief system that never forced me to stop. I didn't realize that consistency works both ways, that just as presence builds connection, Absence builds distance, and once that distance becomes familiar, it starts to feel normal. By the time I sensed something was wrong, the pattern had already been set, and changing it would have required acknowledging that the small choices I had dismissed for years were anything but small.